We're going to start back in chapter 10. Chapter 10 is similar to chapter 2, that it talks about the Israelites' oppression that they're receiving and experiencing at the hand of their enemies. They're crying out to God, and then God's desire and purpose and plan in setting forth to deliver his people by means of one of these Shophatim, one of the judges. So in Judges 10, we've gone through, in the first 5 verses of this chapter, our 6th and 7th judge. Verse 10 of Judges 10. And the children of Israel cried unto the Lord, saying, We have sinned against thee, both because we have forsaken our God and also served Baalim. And the Lord said unto the children of Israel, Did not I deliver you from the Egyptians, and from the Amorites, and from the children of Ammon, and from the Philistines, the Zidonians also, and the Amalekites, and the Maonites did oppress you? Ye cried unto me, and I delivered you out of their hand. Yet ye have forsaken me, and served other gods. Wherefore I will deliver you no more. Go and cry unto the gods which ye have chosen, and let them deliver you in the time of your tribulation. And the children of Israel said unto the Lord, We have sinned. Do thou unto us whatsoever seemeth good unto thee. Deliver us only, we pray thee, this day. In other words, they said they were willing to accept what punishment that God wanted to put on them temporarily, just so long as in the long run he was going to deliver them. And they put away the strange gods from among them and served the Lord, and his soul was grieved for the misery of Israel. Then the children of Ammon were gathered together and encamped in Gilead. And the children of Israel assembled themselves together and encamped in Mizpah. And the people and princes of Gilead said one to another, What man is he that will begin to fight against the children of Ammon? He shall be head over the inhabitants of Gilead. Really, verses 17 and 18 should have gone with chapter 11, because they introduced chapter 11 to us. Remember, the Bible's not written in chapters, though. It's just written in one long continuous stream from the beginning of the book to the end of the book, and then later on men put our chapter and verse divisions in here. And it would have been better to end it with verse 16, because we're going to be talking about the Gileadites, one particular Gileadite, the son of Gilead, in chapter 11, and therefore we need verses 17 and 18 of chapter 10 to understand that. In verse 7 of chapter 10, remember, they've gone into a twofold captivity. On one hand, they've gone into captivity at the hands of the Philistines, and on the other hand, the Ammonites. Samson will be the one raised up sometime around this same time here, although he comes later in the book in chapter 13, to deliver them from the Philistines, and then the man in chapter 11, Jephthah, raised up to deliver them from the Ammonites. This is one of the hints that we have of the twofold oppression, both of which are overlapping one another at the hand of the Philistines and the Ammonites. Now, chapter 11, we've already looked now at verses 17 and 18. The children of Ammon have gathered themselves together, and they're encamped against the people over in Gilead, and so Israel has gathered together in Mizpah. Now, Jephthah the Gileadite, this was the country on the eastern side of the Jordan River, was a mighty man of valor, and he was the son of an harlot, and Gilead begat Jephthah. And Gilead's wife bare him sons, and his wife's sons grew up, and they thrust out Jephthah, and said unto him, Thou shalt not inherit in our father's house, for thou art the son of a strange woman. Then Jephthah fled from his brethren, and dwelt in the land of Tob, and there were gathered vain men to Jephthah, and went out with him. And it came to pass in process of time, this is back to verses 17 and 18, that the children of Ammon made war against Israel. And it was so that when the children of Ammon made war against Israel, the elders of Gilead went to fetch Jephthah out of the land of Tob, which is north of Gilead. And they said unto Jephthah, Come and be our captain, that we may fight with the children of Ammon. And Jephthah said unto the elders of Gilead, Did not ye hate me, and expel me out of my father's house? And why are ye come unto me now, when ye are in distress? The elders of Gilead said unto Jephthah, Therefore we turn again to thee now, that thou mayest go with us, and fight against the children of Ammon, and be our head over all the inhabitants of Gilead. And Jephthah said unto the elders of Gilead, If ye bring me home again to fight against the children of Ammon, and the Lord deliver them before me, shall I be your head? And the elders of Gilead said unto Jephthah, The Lord be witness between us, if we do not so according to thy words. Then Jephthah went with the elders of Gilead, and the people made him head and captain over them, and Jephthah uttered all his words before the Lord in Mizpah. Some sorry words, as we'll see later on here in this chapter. Now, Jephthah is our 8th judge, and he's a little like David in that he has gathered together, while he's been in the land of Tob, a band of renegades and outlaws. David had a group of 400 to 600 men, similar to the group surrounding Jephthah, that we assume had surrounded Jephthah at this time, surrounding him once he was expelled out of the court of King Saul. Now, this land of Tob is just north or southeast of the Sea of Galilee, so you're going to be a little bit north of Gilead, and he's gone up there to dwell and sojourn on his own, because he, out of all the other people in his family, is the only son born, verse 2, of a strange woman. So he is different from his other brothers and sisters that he has, and as a result, they and the rest of the people there of their particular town expel him from out of their coast. Now, evidently, in the land where Jephthah has gone, he's become such a mighty man. He's called there in verse 1 a mighty man of valor. Probably in his military feats that he has performed. We're not told anything about these, but he's a mighty man of valor, and evidently news is spread all the way back to the people here at Gilead, because whenever it comes time to fight the Ammonites, he's the first one they think of. And he's the very one that they cast out from their presence, but he's the first one they think of whenever they think we need a head over us to come and help deliver us from the Ammonites. And so he wants to go back and wants to be placed in charge over all of them, which is exactly what he does. Now, we've got a long passage here from verse 12 all the way down through verse 28 of some very interesting correspondence between Jephthah, who's judge now in Israel, and the king of the Ammonites, the foe against which Israel is fixing to go. They've sent messengers back and forth between each other, passing on information. We're not going to read that long passage, but you can read that later. So we come to verse 29. Then the Spirit of the Lord. So God also now, don't think of just the people having appointed him judge over them. God in his concurrence is concurring with their appointment of Jephthah as judge, because here in verse 29 it says that the Spirit of the Lord has come upon him. Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah, and he passed over Gilead, Manasseh, and passed over Mizpah of Gilead, and from Mizpah of Gilead he passed over unto the children of Ammon. And Jephthah vowed a vow unto the Lord, and said, If thou shalt without fail deliver the children of Ammon into mine hands, then it shall be that whatsoever cometh forth of the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the children of Ammon shall surely be the Lord's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering. Now, this is what we want to look at now. Verses 30 and 31, known as Jephthah's controversial vow. You are supposed to have been considering yourself this week in studying the passage, the pros and cons of both sides, and then what is the scriptural solution to verses 30 and 31 of Judges 11. Now, we see the vow that he vows, and we see a fulfillment of it in verses 38 and 39. So what is the nature and what is the extent both of his vow and of the fulfillment of his vow? Now, the first thing you have to come to is the place where you realize that only one of two things happened here. And you can only hold one of these two positions. Either Jephthah did actually kill his daughter, or either Jephthah did not kill his daughter. Now, if he did not kill his daughter, then there are several different possibilities that we could look at that would extend beyond that. Now, if he did kill her, then that's the end of the story, and we would just be stuck with that he did kill her, and that's the end of the story. So we have to realize, first of all, that only one of these two positions can be held. It's not the position, did he make a vow or not? We just read the vow that he made there. But the question is, did Jephthah kill his daughter, or did Jephthah not kill his daughter? Let's go on and read some here, and then we want to look at some arguments on both sides. This is what we do in Old Testament and New Testament introduction. When we come upon some of the, not all of them, but some of the more important problem passages that are just hotly debated in theological and evangelical circles, and we need to deal with these. Because, dear friends, God expects us, if he's given us verses 30 through 40, that would be 11 verses on Jephthah's vow and the fulfillment of it. Now, in 11 verses, I'm sure he told us what happened. That's another thing you got to come to. You got to come to the point, first of all, that you realize there's only two positions you can hold. Either he did kill her or he didn't. Secondly, you've got to come to the point that in 11 verses here, he's bound to tell us what happened. I mean, it's not the end of a verse or something that we're going to base our whole belief on, of whether this was a literal fulfillment or a typical fulfillment of the vow that he has given there. But God wants us to know what happened here, or he would have just told us about the vow and then said, and then Jephthah defeated his enemies, period, and then we'd start with chapter 12 and go on from there. But if he's gone on to say some more things, and we want to look at this, and it's been hotly debated, it's still debated today, and only these major problem texts, the ones that we are dealing with, and this is one of them here, so we're going to be looking at it in detail here this evening to begin with. So Jephthah passed over unto the children of Ammon to fight against them, and the Lord delivered them into his hands. So that fulfills verse 30. The first part of his vow was, Lord, if, then. If you'll deliver, then I'll deliver. So it's an if-then vow, and the if has gotten fulfilled now in verse 32. And he smote them from a rower even till thou come to Minnith, even 20 cities, and unto the plain of the vineyards with a very great slaughter. Thus the children of Ammon were subdued before the children of Israel. Now we come to the then part. Now the if is very easy to see. Go back and look at verse 30. Jephthah vowed a vow to the Lord and said, If thou shalt without fail deliver the children of Ammon into my hands. Verse 32, So Jephthah passed over unto the children of Ammon to fight against them, and the Lord delivered them into his hands. Reads just like verse 30. Now there's no question about did the first part of the if-then vow get fulfilled. The question revolves around the second half. So we've got verses 34 through 40 to look at in the second part of his vow. Jephthah came to Mizpah unto his house, and behold, his daughter came out to meet him with timbrels and with dances, and she was his only child. Beside her he had neither son nor daughter. So it's wanting to give us a full understanding of his domestic situation here. No son, no daughter, besides the one. It came to pass when he saw her that he rent his clothes and said, Alas, my daughter, thou hast brought me very low, and thou art one of them that trouble me. For I have opened my mouth unto the Lord, and I cannot go back. And she said unto him, My father, if thou hast opened thy mouth unto the Lord, do to me according to that which hath proceeded out of thy mouth. Now, how did she know that whatever he had said had to do with her? Because he's not told her what he said now. But she's pretty wise. She says, Father, if you've opened your mouth to the Lord, then go ahead and do that which you've said about me. Forasmuch as the Lord hath taken vengeance of thee, of thine enemies, even of the children of Ammon. Well, how did she know about the first part of his if-then vow? He said, if you'll deliver them, and she said, they've been delivered to you. And she said unto her father, Let this thing be done for me. Let me alone 2 months, that I may go up and down upon the mountains and bewail my virginity, I and my fellows, female fellows. And he said, Go. And he sent her away for 2 months, and she went with her companions and bewailed her virginity upon the mountains. And it came to pass at the end of 2 months that she returned unto her father, who did with her according to his vow which he had vowed, and she knew no man. And it was a custom in Israel that the daughters of Israel went yearly to lament the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite 4 days in a year. Okay, let's start off first of all with some of the arguments on both sides of these and see which ones hold the most weight in light of Scripture. And we're going to consider first of all the position that he did not physically and literally kill his daughter. Now we can't say sacrifice because that can mean several different things, but we want to use the word kill so you'll understand what type of sacrifice we are talking about here. Now whether that's the type of sacrifice that he's talking about in Judges 11 is beside the point right now. But the two positions are that either he did not kill his daughter or he did. They all, see, everyone, both liberals, conservatives, and the liberals generally believe the right position, and the conservatives are divided right down the middle. But all of them believe that he sacrificed his daughter. But what does the word sacrifice mean, though? See, that's why we have to use the word kill here. It's not an argument over did he sacrifice his daughter or did he not. But did he kill his daughter? Or did he not kill her? Was she to be a burnt offering, a sacrificial burnt offering, or was she only going to be sacrificed insofar as the prophet Samuel was, in that she would be given to the Lord and to the ministry and to the temple there, or like Anna, the prophetess, was over in the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, where she would serve with in her perpetual virginity there the Lord. So let's look at some arguments on the side that he did not kill his daughter. First of all, we're informed that, remember this long passage here from verse 12 through 28, that in Jephthah's correspondence to the king of Ammon, he reveals such an accurate knowledge of the Pentateuch that he certainly would have known that the Pentateuch forbade human sacrifice. Now that's why this long passage here from verse 12 through verse 28 is important, because they tell us, it's said, for those that hold this position, that he did not kill his daughter, that in all these verses here we can see that Jephthah is manifesting a very accurate knowledge of the Pentateuch. He knows a lot about the Pentateuch. He's even got there in verse 26, how many years it's been? 300 years. So he's up with his chronology, and if he understands, and you realize this, if you understand the chronology of the Bible, that's so difficult, you're bound to understand all the teaching of the Bible, because the chronology fits into the teaching. So he's got a number in verse 26, 300 years. And if he is this accurate on his knowledge of the Pentateuch, then certainly he'd know some of the laws of Moses. You cannot sacrifice your children. That's something that God forbade them to do. Secondly, it is stated that certainly Jephthah would have known that the first to come out of his house would probably be his daughter. Or at least some human being would have been the first to greet him out of his house. The terminology used in verse 34 and in verse 31, where he says, "And it shall be that whatsoever cometh forth out of the doors of my house to meet me," that's never used anywhere in the Old Testament referring to an animal. It's always used, the words there and the terminology is always used in referring to a human. Now, if someone said, well, maybe he was hoping, his dog or something would come out, well, you see, we just did away with that right then, because this is never used to refer to animals. It's always used to refer to people. Therefore, Jephthah would have to have known, certainly, he would have to have known that the first thing to greet him out of his house would have been a human being. So evidently it looks like he's planning all this in advance. He's actually going to murder someone when he gets back home, if that's the correct interpretation. Thirdly, Jephthah must have been a righteous and godly man. Why? Because he made it into Hebrews 11 with people like Abel and Enoch and Abraham and Moses and King David. So he certainly would have had to have been a godly and righteous man. And godly and righteous men don't go around sacrificing their daughters. Because he makes it into the 11th chapter of the book of Hebrews. Another argument, we're going to come back and look at these in a moment. Another argument based on verses 30 and 31, that God certainly would not have fulfilled the if part of Jephthah's vow if he knew what Jephthah was really going to do in killing his daughter when he got home. All God would have to do is deliver the Israelites into the hands of the Ammonites, and therefore his daughter wouldn't have been killed, sacrificed, if that's what happened to her. So the contention is that God would have simply failed his part of the vow in verse 30, so that the second part of the vow in verse 31 would also have become null and void and would have failed to come to pass. Another argument from verse 31 is that the conjunction and should be translated or. And we want to go back and just look at this. Verse 31, the conjunction and should be translated or. And you've got to kind of follow along and think into this to see what Jephthah would be saying if this conjunction should be or. Notice what you've got in your margin when we get there. Then it shall be that whatsoever cometh forth of the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the children of Ammon shall surely be the Lord's, or I will offer it up for a burnt offering. Now you've got that in your margin there. You see that in your margin if you've got a Bible like mine, or I will offer. Now here's the thrust of what he's saying if we're going to translate that or. He says, when I return in peace from the children of Ammon, shall surely be the Lord's, and that means if it's a human, I'll dedicate him to the service of the Lord, or if it's an animal, then I will offer it up for a burnt offering. That's what this would mean if we would get or. That's what it could mean if we translated this conjunction or rather than and. What he would mean would be, where he says, shall surely be the Lord's, that would refer to a human being. He would offer them, of course, to temple service, or if it's an animal, you have to read that into it, of course, but that could be the understanding if the word is to be or I will offer it for a burnt offering. In other words, I've got two choices when I come home. It's either going to be a human or an animal. If it's a human, I'll dedicate him to the temple. If it's an animal, I'll give it for a burnt offering. So you've got an either-or situation rather than an and situation. Now that's different if you've got an and situation. If you've got an or, if you've got an and, you've got to take both of them, the first one and the second one. If you've got an or, then it's an either-or. You either have to do the first one or the second one. And since, of course, they'll go on to say, since it wasn't an animal, we read from verse 34, it was his daughter, then all he had to do was fulfill the first part of this either-or thing. If it's the daughter, then surely she shall be the Lord's. Remember how Hannah, Samuel's mother, said that once I have this child, she told Eli, when I conceive and bear a child, then he shall be the Lord's. And what she meant by that was that I'll surrender him up to the service of the temple for the rest of his life, which is exactly what Samuel did. That's over in 1 Samuel chapter 1. Okay, another argument is that the word lament in verse 40 means to talk to. You've got that in your margin also. Verse 40, the word lament means to talk to. And it was a custom in Israel that the daughters of Israel went yearly to talk to the daughter of Jephthah, the Gileadite, 4 days in a year. Now you've even got that, as I say, over in your margin. So if that's true, then she's still alive when they go to talk to her 4 days out of every year. Another argument is that at this particular time in Israel's history, there was a group of permanent women who stayed permanently at the tabernacle. Based on Exodus 38:8, 1 Samuel 2:22. There's a permanent group of women who have dedicated themselves to the service of God, and they stay at the temple, or no temple at this time, at the tabernacle, which would be in Shiloh. Then one final argument for the position that he did not kill his daughter is that there would be no point in this repetitive mentioning of her virginity. There'd be no point in mentioning this if he actually sacrificed her in killing her. What's the point then in mentioning her virginity several times? She went to bewail her virginity. Doesn't it make more sense that she is bewailing her virginity because now she realizes that, of course, once you're dedicated to the temple like that, you're going to remain single, or the woman will remain single and have to remain a virgin the rest of her life. Wouldn't it make more sense to assume that she's bewailing her virginity because she realizes that now she may live another 60 years or maybe another 70 years, but she'll have to stay a virgin the rest of her life? So she's bewailing the fact that she's a virgin. And now, I don't know how many of those are, but those are the chief arguments. There are some other minor ones that we're not going to mention. Those are a list of the chief arguments for the position that he did not kill his daughter. Now, are any of you confused yet? You all have the answer, okay? Let's go back and look at each one of these arguments then, and then we'll add some additional ones. So these will be arguments in favor of the fact that he did kill his daughter. And we'll first of all have to go back and answer each one of these before we can add any additional ones to that. So arguments in favor of the fact that he did kill his daughter. And these first ones will simply correspond to the ones I've just given you. We'll have to answer these, okay? The first argument for that he did not kill his daughter was that this long message of his to the king of Ammon reveals a very accurate knowledge of the Pentateuch, and therefore he certainly would have known that it was against the rule and command of God to sacrifice his daughter. That's true. But just because a person knows that it's against the law and rule of God, does that mean that he's going to obey that law and rule? David knew. He knew a lot more about the Bible than Jephthah did, but did that keep him from committing adultery and then afterwards murder? Nope. So it's a weak argument. Sure, he knew the Pentateuch real well. But there are just a whole lot of people around that know a whole lot about the Bible and just go right on disobeying it. In other words, your knowledge of the Bible doesn't equal your obedience to the knowledge that you have. The second argument. Certainly he must have known his daughter would have come out of the house. That's probably right, but that's why we call Jephthah's vow Jephthah's rash vow. How many times have you said something or not said something or done something or not done something that if you would have thought a little more about it, you would have done just the opposite? But you made a rash statement or you did a rash deed. And if you would have thought about the consequences, you probably wouldn't have done it then, or you probably would have changed your mind then. But in a heat of passion or anger or excitement, it could go either way. Maybe you say something or maybe you do something that if you would have thought about it more, you would realize the consequences, and therefore you wouldn't have done it. That certainly could have been true in this case. I mean, you don't ever want to say, I'll never be a part of that church where they speak in tongues and believe in divine healing, because that's just what God will do. Baptize you in the Holy Spirit and get you over there so he'll show that he's in control and not you. Don't make those statements, I'll never believe all that they believe there, because you're liable to believe everything we believe if you come here long enough. See, there's an example right there of making a rash statement or a rash vow. I'll never believe that. You'll never talk me into that. But watch out when you say that, because you may just have made a rash vow then. Not an actual vow, but a rash statement there. Because if you stay around the Word of God long enough, He'll talk you into believing it. If you've got any sense of an open, honest heart before Him, He'll talk you into it. Even though at the beginning you may be set against believing that. If you have an honest and open heart, sure, He'll talk you into believing that. You'll start believing that. I'll never get out of debt. Well, if you confess it all the time, you may not. But if you confess that with the attitude, I don't believe that that's scriptural now, I just don't believe that God actually, loves me and cares for me enough to pay my bills for me, He's liable to show you that He does love you enough to pay your bills for you. And there again, you would have made a rash statement that you had to go back on later on because it got changed. Well, anyway, the third argument, based on the fact he's a godly man in Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11 is not the chapter on godliness, it's the chapter on faith. And guess who else we have in there? Rahab and Samson. And they do some rather ungodly things in their life. He's not placed, in other words, in Hebrews 11 because he's godly. He's placed in Hebrews 11 because he had faith that God would deliver the Ammonites into his hand. Argument doesn't stand again, in other words. The next argument, God wouldn't have fulfilled his part of the vow when he saw the serious consequences. Oh, yes, he was, because he was fighting not on behalf of Jephthah, but on behalf of Israel. And if someone makes a rash vow and something happens as a result of that later on, God's fighting for his whole people, because back in chapter 10, remember, they are the ones, not Jephthah. Israel is the one who's cried out to God for deliverance. And in verse 16 of chapter 10, his soul was grieved for the misery not of Jephthah, but the misery of Israel. So it's beside the point whether a half a dozen people have made a foolish vow that they're going to have to fulfill later on. He's not fighting on their behalf, per se. He's fighting on behalf of Israel. The conjunction of verse 31, should it be or and? It should be and. Now, we don't have time to try to prove that to you, but just believe us. It should be and. The conjunction is and not or here. So your margin's wrong there. Sometimes your margin's right, but here's one of those times where it's not. Of verse 31. Your margin has or I will offer. But the text says and I will offer. So you've got a 1-2 thing that you have to do and not an either or. What about the word lament in verse 40? The margin gives us to talk with. Well, this word, by the way, this word is not the same word that's used earlier here in the account that does mean lament or bewail, as we see back up in verse 37 and in verse 38. It's a different word here. Now, if it was the same word, we'd know that it means bewail or lament. I mean, that means the same thing, obviously. But we've got a different word here in verse 40, where it reads that the daughters of Israel went yearly to lament the daughter of Jephthah, the Gileadite, 4 days in a year. And the margin, and they tell us that it means to talk with. Well, this word appears only one other time in the Hebrew Scriptures, and that happens to be right here in the book of Judges, several chapters earlier. Back in chapter 5 and verse 11 is the only other place where this word appears in the Hebrew Old Testament. So let's go back here and see what it means, and that ought to help us determine what it's going to mean in verse 40. It's got to mean one of these two things, or something in between, to lament or to talk to. Now, I guess you realize those are just opposite things. To lament, you know what Jeremiah's Lamentations are all about? Death. That's what Lamentations are about, death. So if you're lamenting someone's dead, if you're talking to them, they're still alive, or either you're mixed up in spiritualism. Judges 5:11, they that are delivered from the noise of archers, and I believe Archer holds that first view that we covered there. In the places of drawing water, there shall they rehearse. It's the same word, the righteous acts of the Lord, even the righteous acts toward the inhabitants of his villages in Israel, then shall the people of the Lord go down to the gates. Okay, let's go back over here to verse 40. And put in the same type of meaning here. What the word really means is to recount. So we'll change it to recount. That's what the word really means, to recount. And it was the custom in Israel that the daughters of Israel went yearly to recount about the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite 4 days in a year. In other words, you've got a memorial, more or less, to her, a memorial of remembrance, 4 days in each year where they go back and recount or rehearse the story. Does not mean to talk to. Time number 2 that your margin's been wrong, and all in one chapter, just in chapter 11 here. Then the other argument, what about the permanent class or group of women who remain around the tabernacle at Shiloh? Exodus 38 and verse 8, this is such an obscure passage, there's no way you're going to be able to base anything on this. We're going to read it and not even deal with it. Exodus 38 and verse 8. I mean, you have to read in italics to get what you want to see here anyway. And he made the laver of brass, the foot of it of brass, of the looking glasses of, in italics, the women assembling, which assembled at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. Now, I guess you realize the whole nation assembled at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. It says nothing about a permanent group or sisterhood, if you will, of women that gather together here. 1 Samuel 2:22 was the other passage. And it likewise has nothing to say about any permanent group of women here. It just talks about a bunch of loose women, prostitutes, that are coming and sleeping with the 2 sons of the high priest at this particular time in Israel at the door of the tabernacle. 2:22, now Eli was very old and heard all that his sons, Hophni and Phinehas, did unto all Israel, and how they lay with the women that assembled at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. So you've got women assembling here. Perhaps they want to assemble there every day, but you've got men that assemble there every day too. And if they're not Levites or priests, then we don't just right off the bat assume that maybe this is some particular class or brotherhood of men who have vowed themselves to celibacy for the rest of their life, and they camp out here at the door of the tabernacle. And you don't have any teaching anywhere at this time in Israel's history that you've got women who reside there permanently, in other words. Now you do when you get over to the New Testament. Anna said that she stayed in the temple night and day with fastings and prayers. But that's many thousands of years later, though. I mean, we're over 1,000 years before that. And what works itself out in Israel's economy later on, when we get over into the Gospel of Luke, is beside the point concerning what's taking place here in Judges 11. Then their final and their greatest, what they think is their greatest argument, concerns the fact that she's bewailing her virginity. But listen, we want to read the text again here so you'll see the point. It is laboring the point here, and it's laboring it for the reason so that you can see that she's fixing to die. That's the point that he's mentioning, that she's a virgin. You've got to read into the text that she is sad that she's going to have to be a virgin for the next 60 years. You see, she is sad because she's a virgin right now. In other words, she wished that she weren't a virgin, that she already had a child, so that when she died, she'd have a child to carry on her life and part of her. That's what she wished at this time. And she's bewailing her virginity because she's only got 2 months to live. Now, if it's just her virginity, you see, if it's just her virginity that she's upset about, all that takes is just a few minutes to correct. But that doesn't give you any children, though. You got to have 9 months, and all she's got is 2 months. So you see, you've got to see more of what's being said here. She's bewailing the fact that she doesn't have any children, because she could correct her virginity in a hurry. Verse 37, and she said unto her father, let this thing be done for me. Let me alone 2 months, that I may go up and down the mountains and bewail my virginity, I and my fellows. And he said, go. And he sent her away for 2 months, And she went with her companions and bewailed her virginity. So there's the second time. It is laboring the point here that she's a virgin in the end. And there's a point and a purpose to that. For you to realize, and for everyone that reads the account to realize, that she sees soon coming death cutting her life off, and she's sad that she's a virgin at this time. So we've seen her mention virginity twice, verse 37, verse 38. Now it's going to mention it for the third time in verse 39. And you see, it's this particular fact of the story, basically, that stood out to people that came up with the other view. This was the point that stood out. The other points you have to invent afterwards. But when they get to verse 37, and it says she's bewailing her virginity, verse 38, it says she's bewailing her virginity. In verse 39, it says that she knew no man, which is a scriptural knowing, means that she's a virgin in verse 39. Then they say, well, why is it laboring the point then? Unless she was going to become some type of celibate unto the Lord. Verse 39, and it came to pass at the end of 2 months that she returned unto her father, who did with her according to his vow which he had vowed, and she knew no man. So there's the third time that it says that she's a virgin, and then we go on to read about the custom that they have in Israel. So what I'm saying is she's bewailing the fact that she doesn't have any children at this time to carry on her name and her life. Virginity's not the problem. She could have gotten married real quickly and then not have been a virgin and then gone on to serve the Lord the rest of her life in the temple without her husband. Because remember, if you think that they had to be a virgin all their life, remember Anna had a husband at one time. If you go over there and read the Gospel of Luke, Anna started off with a husband. She just didn't end up with one. So she wasn't a virgin or anything like that. Now, the word virgin does occur there, but you've got to understand the text. I think she's 84 years old there, and it tells how long she lived with the husband from her virginity. But that's another point. Well, now that answers the arguments that they gave. Let me give you some other ones in favor of what is obviously the scriptural position that Jephthah did kill his daughter. Now, none of those stand up right there. But let's go on and look at some other ones. I don't know what number we're on, but the next one, Jephthah is the son of a prostitute. And bad parental influence can influence you later on in your life. I mean, this is a point that we need to remember, and it's specifically stated in chapter 11, verses 1 to 2, that he's the son of Gilead, but he's also the son of a prostitute. So see, Jephthah started off on a bad foot already. I mean, this, friends, is no argument that he knows a lot about the Bible. Just think about all the people that know a lot about the Bible that still go out and commit adultery today. That doesn't prove anything, that you know a lot about the Bible, and all of a sudden it's going to make you godly for the rest of your life. If you're practicing what you know, then you'll be all right. But he started off as the son of a harlot, so he's had a bad influence in the beginning. Just because he goes on and learns a lot about the Pentateuch doesn't change the fact that he's had bad influence in the beginning. Then another argument beyond those first ones is that Jephthah lived on the east side of Jordan rather than the west side. And remember, it's the east side who always falls into sin and captivity and idolatry first, because they're separated from the temple or the tabernacle and later the temple by the Jordan River. Now, we're not given any hint in Scripture that God was actually displeased with the Reubenites and Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh for settling there. But we see that his primary blessing was on the tribes and the people who lived on the western side of the Jordan River. That's where he wanted his people to be, so they could surround the tabernacle and, of course, later on Jerusalem, which would be his holy city there. The people on the eastern side of the Jordan River always were in trouble with their enemies. They had the Amalekites, the Ammonites, coming in from the east and from their south, always harassing them. And Jesus, of course, does most of his ministry on the western side of the Jordan River. He does go over into the region that the very end of Matthew 4 calls Decapolis, which was a Greek confederation of 10 cities. And he goes to several places there on the east, but most of his ministry we see from the Synoptic Gospels is based in Galilee, and from John's Gospel is based in Judea. He spends, of course, much more time up around the city of Capernaum than anywhere else. And there again, we're on the western side of the Jordan River. We're in Palestine proper there, where we've got people who are still faithful, many of the people still faithful at that time to the revelation that God had given. So this again is a strike against him if he lives on the east side. Another argument is that in chapter 12, and let's see, verse 6, Jephthah kills 42,000 of his own brethren. See, you might not realize that. He kills 42,000 Ephraimites, and they're part of Israel. They're his own flesh and blood. And if he can kill 42,000, he can certainly kill one daughter. You can see that in chapter 12 and verse 6. We'll be looking at that when we get to chapter 12. But chapter 12 and verse 6, he kills 42,000 Ephraimites simply because they couldn't pronounce the name right. Sibboleth rather than Shibboleth. So it wouldn't have been a problem just to kill one. Then we've got what I call the two conclusive arguments in favor of the fact that he did kill his daughter. The first of these, from verse 31, is the fact that he uses the Hebrew word olah, O-L-A-H, which without exception means a burnt offering, totally consumed by fire. Now, if he would have used another type of word for another type of offering, a trespass offering or something, that'd be a little bit different. But he uses O-L-A-H, olah, the one term, the one word that means a burnt offering wholly consumed on the altar for God. Now, I know this is kind of pagan when you think about strapping your own daughter there on the altar. But remember, we're living in pagan times at this time. And that is the second conclusive argument. Remember the period that we're in here. It's the period of the Judges. Now, if this were King David or something doing that, or, the Apostle John or something to his daughter, well, maybe we'd look at that a little more and think, now, maybe there's some symbolism in here that we should understand. David's not going to murder his own son, or John's going to murder his own son.
For the continual